All right, welcome everybody to the Law Letters presentation with Professor Rick Hasen, who's joining us today by Zoom. We're very excited and pleased to have him here with us. He's the Gary T. Schwartz Endowed Chair in Law at UCLA Law School, where I believe he's also the director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. He's one of the country's leading experts in election law, co-author of one of the leading casebooks in election law. And I believe he's also serving right now as the NBC News and MSNBC Electoral Law Analyst, which he did the same for CNN in 2020. Author of over 100 articles on election law issues, published in journals including the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Supreme Court Review, the Yale Law Journal. I was just reading your latest piece in the YLJ. Op-eds and commentaries have appeared in publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Politico, and Slate. Published numerous books. I sort of lost count trying to attend to them, but among the most salient ones that stood out to me were the Justice of Contradictions, Antonin Scalia and the Politics of Disruption, Cheap Speech, How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. And then the latest book, which looks like it was just published in February, I think, of this year by Princeton, and it's called A Real Right to Vote, How a Constitutional Amendment Can Safeguard American Democracy. And I know he's a very busy person during the election season doing vital outreach and media work. So it's really a privilege for us here at Chicago to have some time here today to hear from him about election law and its relationship to the 2024 election. So I won't take up any more time. I'll turn things over to Rick to have a chat with us. So Rick, please.
Great. Thank you, David. And it's great to be with all of you. I'm going to speak for maybe 20 minutes or so. I'd rather hear your questions. But I thought I would set the stage by just talking about comparing where we are in 2024 compared to where we were in 2020. How did we get to this place where we can no longer take for granted that we'll have peaceful transitions of power? How do we get to this place where we now have concerns about subverting election outcomes? Really not the kind of thing I thought as someone, in the second half of my career anyway, would be worried about in the United States. I thought I'd be going off to other countries and dealing with transitions to democracy. And instead, we have our own democracy problems. So if we back up a little bit, I think we can trace the modern period of election fights to the 2000 election, the one that ended with a dispute over Florida's electoral college votes, culminating in the United States Supreme Court's decision in Bush versus Gore. That was a pretty monumental decision from the point of view of election law, election administration, because it really emphasized how our elections are decentralized, partially partisan, and not necessarily well run everywhere. That last part has gotten a lot better since 2000. We got rid of really bad voting machines. There's been a lot more focus on election administration and the science. But what we did see is that in the aftermath of Bush versus Gore, we've seen almost a tripling of the amount of election litigation in the United States. And this makes the US pretty unique compared to other democracies. Other democracies, they're pretty polarized. You can look at Brexit in the UK. You'd say that was a pretty polarized population there, but there weren't fighting over the rules for elections. It's kind of a uniquely American phenomenon. And part of it is because of the decentralization. So rather than having a national election administrator like they do in Canada or Germany, Australia, France, you pick your Japan, you pick your country, the United States has something like 8,000 different electoral jurisdictions administering elections. And because there's this decentralization, states can pass their own laws subject to certain federal backstops and guarantees that dictate what kind of voting machines are going to be used, how much early voting there's going to be, how difficult it is to register to vote. Lots of these things are in the hands of state governments and sometimes even left localities. So lots of states, localities can decide which voting machines to buy. That's so different than if you're in Canada, could be in Winnipeg or Nova Scotia, and you walk into a polling place, it's going to look the same. The ballots are going to look the same and all that. Once you have the possibility of different rules in different places, you end up with jurisdictions looking to change rules, sometimes to make it better, but sometimes to try to achieve partisan advantage. And anytime election rules are changed, there is an opening for litigation. Americans are a litigious bunch. They like to sue over many things, and elections is one of them. One of the lessons of Bush versus Gore is that if you are being, if you're going to be in a very close election, a game of inches, then the rules of the game might make a difference. And so maybe you would try to change those rules. Maybe you want to make everyone automatically registered to vote, as California is trying to do. If you think that that's going to help Democratic legislators might want to do that. Similarly, if you think that shrinking the electorate might help you, you might impose a requirement of proof of citizenship in order for people to be able to register to vote, as states like Kansas and Arizona have done. And this leads to just tons and tons of litigation. So already before the disputes over the 2020 election, we were involved in what I've called the voting wars, the fights between the parties. And this creates, in some ways, concerns about voter confidence. If you look at polling since 2000, voters whose side win the election are much more confident that the election was fairly run than those who are on the losing side. Kind of unsurprising that people retrospectively view how fair the election was based on the results rather than some kind of view of the process. So even before the 2020 election, every 4 years, I'd be getting calls from reporters, why haven't we fixed our election problem? Why do we have this anxiety about whether we're going to be able to pull off an election? So that's already a bad situation, but the 2020 election made things so much worse. First of all, remember, we were voting in the middle of a pandemic. And because of the pandemic, that meant that there were lots of places making changes in voting rules, making it easier to vote by mail, changing the primaries dates. In some cases, they couldn't get poll workers to work, or there was a COVID surge. I mean, I think we've blocked out some of these things that happened just a few years ago, but they were pretty salient in the 2020 election period. Some jurisdictions didn't make changes, and so then they were sued over those things. For example, really hard to vote by mail in Texas, relatively easy to vote in person by mail. But what about in Texas? If you want to vote by mail and you couldn't prove that you were out of the country, if you were over 65, you could get a ballot to vote by mail, but not if you're under 65, unless you had some other kind of excuse. Did that violate age discrimination provisions in the Constitution? And the court said no. Or what about how one county in Texas, Harris County, where Houston is, allowed for drive-through 24-hour voting, and other parts of the state didn't do that, right? So you had all this kind of fighting over those rules. And you layer on top of that the fact that Donald Trump was relentlessly claiming that the election was going to be rigged or stolen, that mail-in ballots were going to be manipulated. So it created a very volatile mix, and people had a lot of anxiety about how the 2020 election was going to be run. I think looking at all of the studies that have been done of the 2020 election, it actually went better than I expected. It went pretty well, especially given that we were doing things under a pandemic. There wasn't any evidence that was uncovered of great problems in terms of people's access to the ballot, in terms of fraud, in terms of the inability to count votes. Like, everything went pretty well, but Trump nonetheless tried to subvert the election outcome, tried to turn himself from an election loser to an election winner, focusing in particular on states that went for Biden in the Electoral College. That is, the majority of voters or the plurality of voters in the state voted for Biden, but that had Republican majority state legislatures. And the idea was, is there a way to try to manipulate the rules that apply to how the Electoral College works so that you could turn the state from a Biden state to a Trump state by getting the state legislature to maybe step in and try to come up with alternative slates of electors? And this was a very convoluted process. It involved trying to cajole state legislatures as well as election officials like Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, on the call with Trump, being asked to find 11,780 votes. Two attempts to get the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, to declare that there was fraud in Georgia. None of these things worked. The 60-something lawsuits that were filed, they didn't achieve anything because you couldn't really prove that there was a major problem with fraud in the election or irregularities. Some of the arguments would have disenfranchised entire state worth of voters, and it didn't happen. But it was attempted, and even after all of the legal attempts failed, you had Trump calling for those wild rallies in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, which culminated in the storming of the U.S. Capitol as Congress was trying to go through its formal process of confirming Biden as the winner of the presidential election. And so the new threat to elections, which wasn't really on the modern list of things to worry about, was, are we going to have peaceful transitions of power? Are we going to have fair elections? Nobody asked in 2009 when conservative Republican George W. Bush was finishing his term and liberal Democrat Barack Obama was coming into office, is George Bush going to leave office? Like, this was not something that people were talking about. And yet here there were lots of stories. What is Trump going to do? Even raising questions about civil military relations. So you ended up having this situation where in the end result, this was not successful. There have been over 1,000 people that have been successfully prosecuted for their roles in invading the Capitol. There have been a number of indictments of people who were involved in these fake election schemes. Donald Trump famously has been indicted in both federal court and in Georgia state court for things he tried to do in relation to the election. This was investigated by the January 6th committee. Meanwhile, millions of people believe the false claim that the last election was rigged. Social media helped to fuel all of that by making it easier to spread false information directly to voters without going through intermediaries like the news media. And so it created a very volatile situation. This has led to threats against election workers. We've seen a lot of attrition. People don't want to work in election administration because they're worried about being harassed or facing other kinds of issues. Okay, so that's kind of how we got to where we are. I want to turn a little bit now to the dangers that we face going into 2024 and going into the 2024 election in November, and then ask the question, are there reasons to be more worried or less worried than we were in 2020? So I think that there are three sets of dangers that can arise in relation to the 2024 election. One is simply private acts of violence that could be directed at people that could deter them from voting. I think this is the least likely of the things that I'm worried about, but it is something to be on the list. One of the key political science concepts about democracy is something called loser's consent. It's the idea that when you have a close election and your side loses, you accept that those results are fair and you're not happy about it. You grumble, but you agree that the election was fairly conducted, and you will reorganize and put your candidates up for office again in 4 years or whenever the next election is. When you don't have that and the government is not accepted as legitimate, then there's the risk of political violence. There's the risk of civil disobedience. So you don't think the government is legitimately run. And, we have actual countries where elections are not fairly run, and there are protests in the streets, and there are general strikes, and there's, potential violence and all of that. That can also happen if you have a fair election, if enough people don't believe the election is fair. And it might cause people, excuse me, to do things they otherwise might not do, like violently interfere with the election. Okay, so that's one risk that we face. A second risk that we face is actions by foreign actors to try to interfere with our elections. We already see some of that attempted in terms of interfering with information. So according to the government, the US government, at least three countries, Russia, China, and Iran, are all trying to engage in influence operations, pretending to be American citizens on social media, trying to manipulate public opinion. I'm somewhat less concerned about that for reasons we can talk about in terms of the information environment. I think everyone's discounting everything they see now. And so in some ways, there's a bit less of a danger of people being manipulated by that or manipulated by some AI deep fake or something like that. I'm more worried about some kind of sabotage, like hacking into the electrical grid or doing something that messes with voter registration databases. And in 2016, I should say, we saw the Russian government hack into some voter registration databases. And they didn't really do anything, but I think just the fact that they did it was to show, like your systems are not secure. And, there's so much ransomware and all kinds of problems with cybersecurity, that we can't ignore that. And then the third danger, and this is the one at the top of my list, is the danger that elected or election officials who play a role in certifying the election won't do the right thing. So what saved us in part from chaos and a potential interference with the peaceful transition of power in 2020 was the fact that people like Brad Raffensperger did the right thing. They weren't willing to find the 11,780 votes. They were sticking with what the rules are. Is that going to happen this time? Well, we've got some different people in place. Not everywhere, but take Georgia, for example. In Georgia, you still have Raffensperger as a Secretary of State, but there's a new membership on the state elections board. The Georgia legislature, unhappy that Raffensperger stood up to Trump, removed Raffensperger from the election board. There are now a majority of Trump aligned appointees on that board. They've enacted a set of rules related to certification of the vote totals that would apply to local county election boards across the state. And the concern is that this might cause some chaos or cause some delay. I can get into the details of all of that. But the idea is that these people might not do the right thing. And delay itself could work to create the conditions where you might not see the winner of the election actually declared the winner of the election, at least not on time. And in this regard in particular, we don't know yet who the Speaker of the House is going to be on January 6th, 2025, when it's time for Congress to count the Electoral College votes. It might be Mike Johnson, who's the current Speaker of the House. He has been somewhat equivocal in whether or not he would follow the certification of the votes. We're going to have to see how fair it is, kind of echoing the lines that Trump said, not really affirming in the kind of language that we would hope that, of course, we're going to have free and fair elections and follow the results of the elections wherever they may lead. So this is really something to be concerned about. Okay, last thing I want to talk about, how realistic is this last worry? And so I want to point to three things that I think are different this time compared to last time that make me a little less nervous than I was in 2020. In 2020, I was very nervous. I saw this stuff on the horizon. A lot of people didn't see it coming. I was very worried. I wrote a book that came out at the beginning of 2020 called Election Meltdown, seeing that, we were really in bad shape. Okay, so three things to point to. The first and most significant is that in December 2022, just before the Democrats lost control of the House, they were able to pass on a mostly partisan vote in the House, but on a bipartisan vote in the Senate, something called the Electoral Count Reform Act. The Electoral Count Reform Act changes the kind of technical rules for how Congress counts the Electoral College votes. And what it does is it shuts down a lot of the paths that Trump was trying to pursue in 2020. For example, there was a lot of pressure on Mike Pence, the vice president, who presides as kind of the master of ceremonies over the counting of the Electoral College votes. There was a lot of pressure on Pence to just throw out the electoral votes, just like, these do not have to be counted. There's fraud in the states, and Pence wouldn't do it. So the Electoral Count Reform Act says vice president doesn't have this power. And you can see why Republicans might like that right now, since the vice president is a Democrat, Kamala Harris, who also happens to be the candidate for president. Another strange quirk of the American election system. It also says that state legislatures can't just come in and willy-nilly throw out the votes after voters have voted for president and simply submit their own slates of electors. It creates a right to go to federal court when there are certain disputes over the elections. There's a lot of good stuff in there. It replaces parts of a law that was passed after the disputed election of 1876, the Hayes-Tilden election, something called the Electoral Count Act. That was the old rules. It was so poorly drafted that election law professors couldn't even agree what it meant and how the rules worked. So now at least we have some clarity. Okay, so that's the first thing. So those rules have been clarified and tightened up so that it would be harder to subvert an election through the manipulating the electoral college votes. The second thing that happened is that the Supreme Court decided a case in 2023 called Moore versus Harper. This is a case, it's kind of a complicated case. It involved a state Supreme Court in North Carolina finding that partisan gerrymandering violated the state constitution. And the claim was that in federal elections, the state legislatures statutes trump the state Supreme Court, trump the state constitution, trump everything. Basically, the so-called independent state legislature theory, in its most extreme version, would give state legislatures unbridled power over federal elections. And the Supreme Court in that case rejected the extreme version of that theory and said that state legislatures act as actors within their states. They're subject to, when they pass a law, it's subject to a gubernatorial veto. They're subject to the state constitution. They're subject to the normal state controls. The court did say that sometimes state courts might go too far in how they interpret state constitutions. But what the court did in that case was simply to take off the table this extreme theory that was advanced. Okay, so that it was a very positive development from the court. And then the third reason for me to be more hopeful than I was in 2020 that we'll be able to get through this period is vigilance. The fact that, we're holding this discussion. I'm working, every day on the Safeguarding Democracy Project. I'm speaking to people around the country. People are focused on this issue. We no longer take peaceful transitions of power for granted. Back when Obama replaced Bush, I wrote on my election law blog, we take our democracy for granted. We don't recognize what an achievement this is. Well, I don't think we take it for granted anymore. I think people are very concerned, at least judging by my email inbox. I hear from a lot of people who are very concerned. That concern means that, it's not going to be easy to sneak things by. So when the Georgia Election Board passes some rules that look like it could help to subvert the election, there are lawsuits, there's public protest, there are news articles about it. People are being vigilant. So in the end, I think, we've got a pretty good infrastructure that is helping to deal with these potential threats to our elections. Really, what it comes down to is, are people going to follow the rules? We don't know if Mike Johnson, for example, is actually going to follow the rules. He could make some kind of argument that the Electoral Count Reform Act is unconstitutional and they're going to do something else. Law can only be constraining to people who are willing to be constrained by the law. We don't know if the courts would get involved if there were an attempt. But in the end, there were lots of attempts in 2020 to try to change the election outcome. The election wasn't close enough that it could be litigated to a different result. If it's not close again, and if everyone does what they're supposed to do, we're going to be okay. That's not necessarily a ringing endorsement like I'm not worried at all. But it does mean that we've put in place some guardrails that I think should give us some comfort as we go into the election and post-election period. And with that, let me turn it back over to you, David.
Oh, that's just terrific. Thank you so much. Let me ask you two quick questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone else, but I'm mindful that we only have so much time, so I want to make mine brief. My first is on your third point about vigilance. Is there a counter argument that the side that might be sympathetic to election subversion has now had 4 years to plan in a way that 2020 was more haphazard or spontaneous? or that the same way those who want to defend free and fair elections have become vigilant, those who might be willing to subvert them, it's now more available in their imagination in some sense? Or is there a way that there's sort of a countervailing move against point three? So that's one of my questions. And then my other question is, I'm just curious what your thoughts are about how do we understand the fact that the Supreme Court in so many election law cases over the past decades has settled into decisively partisan decision making about election law, and yet when push came to shove in 2020, the litigation was not so obviously partisan, and that every Trump lawsuit failed. How do we make sense of a court that's willing to be partisan in certain ways and then not in others? What distinguishes those, and what might that tell us about where election law is going in this election or in the future? So those are my two questions.
Great, very different questions. Great questions. So first on, what's happening on the other side, the pro-subversion side. And certainly I think there's planning. I think that's why you've seen these things like the Georgia attempt to change the certification rules to try to, there's all kinds of machinations. I didn't get into the details of this, but, the idea is maybe you can create enough delay, enough smoke so that by the time it comes to January 6th, 2025, no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College. If that happens under the 12th Amendment, there's this separate procedure that comes into play called a contingent election, where each state delegation in the House of Representatives gets one vote. There are more state delegations that are Republican majority, so this would favor Trump. Some of these things were thought of when the ECRA, the Electoral Count Reform Act, was drafted. And so some of these things have been, blocked by the ECRA to the extent that, people are going to follow it. The other thing I would point out is that there are a number of people who have been prosecuted or who are going to be prosecuted for what they did in relation to the 2020 election. And I think that personal criminal liability and potential civil liability as well. Rudy Giuliani is now bankrupt, but criminal liability stands as a deterrent. Are people going to stick their necks out when they know that it didn't work in 2020? And remember, lots of things that were the fodder for claiming in 2020 that there was fraud or irregularities related to COVID, related to the changes in rules that happened. That's not happening this time. Our election rules are more set. People are voting in person if they want to. Things are more normal in terms of how the election is being conducted. So it's not for lack of trying, but I don't think it's that easy. We tend to think of people who are, engaged in potential nefarious activity as being criminal masterminds. But not everybody's so smart, and some of the schemes are pretty harebrained. Okay, on your other question about the understanding the Supreme Court, and I would say the courts more generally, I write about this. You mentioned you started reading my Yale Law Journal draft. I write about this in there a lot.
That's where the question came from, yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to distinguish between the court's kind of normal partisan divide on all kinds of ideological issues, whether that's abortion or immigration or voting rights, versus kind of the very bottom baseline question of, are we going to have peaceful transitions of power, and are we going to accept election results as legitimate? I think on that question, there is much more agreement and unanimity that it is better for the courts to stay as a backstop and to make sure that fair elections are being conducted. And so one of the judges I quote in the article is Judge Stefanos Bibas, who's a Federal Society, very strong conservative. He's on the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. He was taking up an appeal that was brought in Pennsylvania, Rudy Giuliani, trying to get the election results thrown out in Pennsylvania. And Judge Bibas basically said, calling an election fraudulent doesn't make it so. You need to come in with proof. You need to have a good legal theory. You need to have good facts. You don't have either of those things, you lose. I'm paraphrasing, of course. I think that despite the polarization that appears even in the judiciary on questions about free and fair elections and election winners taking office, there's still enough elite consensus that protects us. Now, that could break down, and some of what I worry about in the paper is, when uh, liberals criticize conservative judges as not following the rules when it comes to the rule of law when it comes to voting, are they undermining their own case to provide, this kind of to have courts provide this kind of backstop approach? And I do think that, the more partisan ideological the court is seen as, and the rhetoric around the court, the less that commitment to the bipartisan commitment to free and fair elections is going to be there. And so I think, in the end, the court did the right thing last time. There were some lines in an approach in the Trump immunity case that gives me some pause about how committed the judges are to stopping election subversion. But I'm hopeful that, first of all, I'm hopeful that the election is not close enough. There won't be any plausible theory to try to overturn the results. And that if there are implausible theories that go to the court, they will be rejected, no matter who's bringing them to the court.
Great. Okay, so why don't we open it up now to questions from attendees. So if you have a question, I think we still have the raise your hand little icon here, and we'll try to make our way through these. So why don't we start with Omar?
Hi, yeah, thank you for very, sorry, fix my microphone. Sorry,
Nice.
thanks for a very nice talk, and you convinced me that I don't need to be too worried about 2024, so thanks for that. But my question is more regarding 2028. So suppose Donald Trump wins this year, right? He will basically be a god within the Republican Party. It also means, likely that, they'll do well on the down ballot races. So, there could be a lot of power for disruption of future elections. Like, for example, if they were to, repeal the or they could repeal the Electoral Reform Act, right? If so, how these are people who are not necessarily going to follow the norms and traditions that we're used to, um, and so uh, they may not follow the 60 rule majority in the Senate. So, anyway, all I'm saying is that it seems to me like there's a lot of potential for disruption in future years. Suppose if Donald Trump were to win this year, what do you think?
Yeah, okay. First, let me. I don't want to tell you not to worry about 2024. I would say,
Okay.
I'm a 7 instead of a 9.9. Okay, so
Okay.
let's not over over. Don't cast me as being overly optimistic. I'm just slightly less worried. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Okay.
I do think there's a reason to worry about 2028. One reason is that if J.D. Vance is the sitting vice president, he would be presiding on January 6, 2029, over the Electoral College votes counting in that session. And he, based on what he said at the vice presidential debate, I have some concerns about, so you don't even have to repeal the Electoral Count Reform Act. He could just try and do some other things. I mean, I think that, one question that we don't know is whether Donald Trump has changed the Republican Party in a fundamental way, or whether this is a blip and things will go. I don't think we're going back to Mitt Romney's Republican Party, but that things would go more relatively back to normal in a post-Trump period. Remember, Trump is he 78 now? He'd be 82 then. Who his successor would be, who could have that kind of charisma. Like, we don't know. And, if you look around the world and you look at, charismatic leaders who, have neo-authoritarian tendencies. How do they pass power along? Often to a family member. We don't know what the world's going to look like. I share your concerns about 2028, 2029. I want to get us through 2024 first, 2025. I do think that if this country can make it through the next 5 to 10 years, we are likely to be in better shape. But with changing technology, changing ability of people to communicate misinformation about elections, it's really just hard to predict the future, what the role of AI is going to be, all of these kinds of things. So your time horizon of 4.5 years is even that is a little hard to see. I certainly didn't think when we looked at the events of January 6, 2021, and the kind of pariah status that Donald Trump temporarily had after that invasion, that we'd be in a position where he would be, even money to win the presidential election the next time around. So hard to predict the future, but I do share your concerns.
Ellie, please.
Hi, yeah. So I was also kind of coming to gain some maybe reassurance about what's gonna happen. I don't know. I feel like a little bit better, but I'm still quite anxious. And I think my question to you would be, I think COVID was kind of the perfect breeding grounds for Trump to contest the election. What do you think? I mean, we know he's hired lawyers. I don't think that he's gonna go easily, to put it that way. What do you think, on what grounds do you think he's going to contest the election? Like, what standpoint do you think he'll come from to say, this wasn't a fair and free election?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, if it's 50-50 that he wins the election, he may not have to do that to gain power. He may win the election outright, and Democrats are not likely to contest it in the way that Trump did and try to subvert the election, just based on what we've seen so far from what Democrats are saying. Although it's still possible. Like, one concern is, what if Trump wins and Democrats say, let's say they control the House, and they say, well, we're not going to accept the results as legitimate because Donald Trump is disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And now Democrats have said they're not going to do that, but we shouldn't put that possibility out of mind as something that could happen. Now, in terms of if Trump loses, what he might do, it's very hard to see what the theory would be. Most of the kind of rhetoric that we are seeing around this at this point is rhetoric about non-citizen voting and claims that non-citizens are registering and voting in large numbers. This is not new. This has been around for a long time. Trump, you may remember this, made the claim in the 2016 election, which he won in the Electoral College. He lost by about 3 million votes in the popular vote, which of course is just a beauty contest, but he lost. He said that 3 to 5 million non-citizens voted in that election, all for his opponent, Hillary Clinton. I mean, an outrageous claim. There was a lot of investigation of non-citizen voting because of these claims made by Trump in the 2016 election. And there weren't 3 million or 300,000 or 30,000 or 3,000 or 300. There were maybe 30 cases around the country of possible non-citizen voting. And, this is, it would be crazy as a non-citizen to vote in an election because you'd be committing a felony. You could subject yourself to being deported as well as go to jail. And one person's vote, non-citizen vote, is not going to sway the outcome of the election. So non-citizen voting, if that's the basis on which they're going to try and overturn an election result, it's going to be very hard to do it because there's going to be basically no proof because it is a non-problem. It is such a small problem. So I don't know. That's why I think it's part of the reason why I'm a little more optimistic this time, because it's just very hard to see what the path would be without COVID claiming, oh, look, they've changed these rules. They've done a lot. You'll just have kind of grainy videos and unsubstantiated claims of ballot dumps and things like that we've seen before. So I think that's kind of what we're facing again. What I would characterize as 2020 as weak legal theories, weak factual theories, but not really deterring trying to bring these kinds of arguments to the courts and to the public.
Great. Anna or Anna?
Hello, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. This has been really insightful and has also simultaneously made me a little more worried for the 2024 election, but also given me a tiny bit of reassurance with it. You've touched on it briefly, but I was wondering if you could go more into the current misinformation landscape that we're facing, especially on the internet with AI developing so rapidly and just like a general distrust of information people see online, and how you think that could affect this upcoming election.
Yeah, so we certainly are in a different information environment than we were in 2016, or that we were in 2020 as well. You may remember that in 2020, Twitter and Facebook, they had these big trust and safety teams that were trying to deal with misinformation, the election-related misinformation. They were labeling Donald Trump's tweets as containing false information. They were doing all kinds of different things to try to give voters access to reliable information. Some of that may have backfired. There was just a recent study that found that labeling Trump's tweets as false actually made his supporters believe they were more likely to be true. But you had this effort to try to deal with misinformation. Now, of course, Twitter is no more. There's X, and the biggest spreader of misinformation is actually the owner of the platform, who manages to get himself into everybody's feed and share lots of false and misleading information. What's the effect of that? I think here too, I'm maybe slightly less worried than I was in the past. I used to worry about AI generated content leading to, like, oh, here's a video of this candidate doing this really embarrassing thing or having some kind of health emergency or something. I now think, as your question suggested, that people are so maybe inoculated is the word, from misinformation. They treat everything as false. And so everyone is skeptical of anything they see online. Is that real? And so maybe that provides a little protection for us now. I don't know if it provides enough protection, but it's something. I think it creates a different kind of problem, which is, how do you get people to trust information? If you think that everything is false, how do you get people to trust true information? I think we need to think about ways to signal to people when information can be trustworthy and is reliable. In a partisan, polarized environment, that's really hard to do. One thing that I've suggested is more disclosure of information. So if there's AI generated content, I think it should be labeled as AI generated. California experimented with this. They did it in kind of a ham-handed way that I think violated the First Amendment, but I do think there are ways to deal with this under the First Amendment so that you can balance these two concerns. One, we want to make sure we have robust free speech where people can say what they want about candidates. Doesn't all have to be true. But we also want to make sure that we have free and fair elections. So I would really focus on content that lies about when, where, how people vote, the kind of things that could actually disenfranchise people. I go through a lot of this in my 2022 book, Cheap Speech. I think there is stuff that we can do to give voters reliable information, but I certainly think it's not for lack of trying. There's certainly a lot of misinformation out there about the election, and we're seeing it now with the hurricanes. It can cause some real damage in terms of people's, if you don't believe the government authorities that you need to evacuate, your life could be in danger. Same thing with, you don't believe the COVID vaccines are safe, your life could be in danger. So this stuff is serious. We have to figure out how we can regain some of the public's trust so that they can know what information is trustworthy and reliable.
Emma, please.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I was thinking a lot about kind of the rhetoric around elections and election security. It's been a trend like in the past several elections, but especially in the wake of the 2020 election, there's been a lot of skepticism and distrust around, like among the American people around election security and fairness. I used to work as a poll official in my home state of New Mexico, and I saw it even like firsthand, people coming in and asking if the election process would be safe, and if their vote would actually be counted, even though, yeah, there was no kind of indication it wouldn't be. And so I was wondering specifically with like election law, how would you suggest election law and kind of our practices adapt to the context of this new decade of election rhetoric to safeguard the institution of free and fair elections, like you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. There have been a lot of people working on this issue. One thing that we see is the question is transparency. So, I think initially a lot of our reaction was, well, just like make everything open, everything transparent, and then anybody who's concerned can observe. And for example, in Orange County, California, where I used to teach, you could watch a live feed of the ballots 24/7. You could see the room where the ballots were kept, and you can watch and see what they're doing, and lots of means of observing. Now, because of threats to election officials, full transparency might be a problem. Do you want poll workers' names to be out there? Maybe they're going to face harassment. It's so we have to kind of find that balance. I do think that it's important that we give, especially in places where there's mistrust, give both of the major parties as well as outside groups a chance to observe the process. Lots of local election officials are willing to give tours and explanations of how things work. Really, the communications strategy of these election officials is so important. So if you go back to 2022, Arizona is one of the places where, neighbor to New Mexico, not far away, a lot of fighting about election rules. When they were conducting the election in 2022, there were some ballot tabulators that were malfunctioning. They were not accepting ballots, and all kinds of rumors were spreading on social media. And so then one of the county supervisors and the director of elections made a short video. They put it up on social media. They said, here's what's happening. Here's what we're doing about it. Like, I think that kind of proactive approach, not letting things fester, is really important. Getting official information out there. All election officials should have .gov email addresses, website addresses, I should say, so people can find the right information. They know that they're getting it from the source. And it's not going to convince everybody. We're not going to be in a situation for at least the next decade where everyone's going to trust elections. But we have to aim for the middle and make sure that the people who are willing to think and willing to examine evidence are willing to accept fair evidence that's presented to them.
Erica, please.
Yeah, hello, my name is Erica, and this is the first election I can vote in. So earlier in the forum, you talked or mentioned the 1876 presidential election and how this was a disputed election. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about how this led to the mass disenfranchisement of African American citizens, and if this reflects a lot of modern day voting law changes that are not allowing people of color to vote as much in certain areas.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's true that the aftermath of the 1876 election, kind of that history, the way that the dispute over that election was solved was a compromise where essentially the Reconstruction in the South ended. And you ended up having a period of mass violence against Black voters in southern states and disenfranchisement of many of those voters until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so it was a very heavy price that was paid in order to resolve the dispute over that election. And the effects of that reverberate to this day. I don't think that there is kind of a direct connection between that and, say, the way that we've resolved the disputes over the 2020 election. I don't think that the passage of the ECRA really reflects, some kind of compromise that makes it harder for voters generally or voters of color in particular to be able to vote. I think what it reflected, the fact that the ECRA passed, was that there were enough Republican members in the Senate who shared concern with Democratic members in the Senate and the House that they could put together a coalition because they were worried about, this time it's a Republican trying to subvert the results of the election. Next time it could be a Democrat. That really you need to safeguard the system for the future. And so I'm very happy that the ECRA passed. It's not necessarily going to, passing a statute. It's just a piece of paper. But it is a lot better than if it didn't pass, and it did signal at least some level of bipartisan commitment to free and fair elections. And I don't think that there was any particular compromise. I think where you start seeing laws that make it harder for people to vote, especially people of color, comes in the fact that we have this decentralized, partially partisan election system where election rules can be changed by state and local election officials, and where you have a court system that is not enforcing the Voting Rights Act in the same strong way as it had been enforced in the past. And that's part of it. It goes back to David's earlier question about partisanship on the courts. Certainly, we see conservative judges reading the Voting Rights Act in much more narrow ways. In fact, striking down a part of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional in the Shelby County versus Holder case in the last decade. So there's definitely reason to be concerned about problems with voting rights, but I don't tie it directly to the ECRA. And I should say that my most recent book, A Real Right to Vote, argues that the way we need to protect voting rights ultimately is put an affirmative right to vote in the United States Constitution. Right now, the Constitution doesn't guarantee any person the right to vote. It just says if you're going to hold an election, you can't discriminate on the basis of certain categories like gender or race. So I think we need more protections. I don't trust the courts to fully protect voting rights, and we need to kind of get back to the habit that we had in the past of amending the Constitution to add voting protections to it.
I think we have time for one last question here. Catherine, please.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us. And my question, I don't think you addressed it, but I kind of had concerns about how can current election laws effectively address the growing concern over corporate influence in U.S. elections, particularly when it comes to the potential for like bribery or undue influence on candidates. Obviously, like Trump has a lot of connections in the corporate world, and I've seen some like reports on really big companies like Google being like huge funders of campaigns. And what legal reforms or strategies do you think would like mitigate the impact of large political donations while balancing like constitutional protections of free speech on like elections in general, I guess?
That's a great question. It's probably the appropriate topic for a different webinar because we're at 57 after the hour. And I wrote a whole book on this back in 2016 called Plutocrats United. I'm very concerned about the role of big money in politics. I think it's really problematic. For my own personal work, that's taken a back seat now to concerns about just being able to have peaceful transitions of power and free and fair elections. But I do think that once we get past this moment, we have to think about it. And the real problem, just to give you the 2-second version, the real problem is that the Supreme Court back in 1976, almost 50 years ago, decided a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. And they said that leveling the playing field, using political equality as a reason to limit the influence of big money in politics, violates the First Amendment of the Constitution. And I think that's a wrong reading of the First Amendment, and it's led us to a bunch of problems. But I think that's really a topic for another day. But I do appreciate the question about that.
Thank you so much.
And then with the very last minute we have here, I think you've done a great job of bringing us down from the 9.9 to the 7 or 7.5 you said about 2024. But a couple of times here, you've also said that if we can get through the next 5 to 10 years, you're more optimistic. If you could leave us with some sense of why is it that you're a little bit more optimistic about the medium term, if not the storms of the elections of today and tomorrow?
Well, it's mostly a demographic issue. I think that a lot of the support for the kind of right-wing populism that fuels concerns about authoritarianism and fuels concerns about lack of commitment to democratic principles is generational, and that younger generations are more likely to be the ones that are going to embrace a multicultural 21st century democracy. To the extent that Trumpism relies upon racial tropes, those are going to be harder to push through in a more multiracial, younger society. And so this is why I have some optimism that if we can get past this moment and see more generational change, that we would be in a better position to have elections that we can feel confident that whoever wins the election is actually going to be able to take office and be accepted as a legitimate leader.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Hasen, for joining us. I found it enormously edifying and in a way reassuring, and I hope some of our students did as well. Thank you again, and thank you for putting out the good word for us and for other people all across the country. Thank you for your work.
I appreciate the opportunity, and it was great to speak with all of you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.